Welcome back to Deep Thoughts, ladies and gentlemen, as I sport my SoCal Angels apparel. It's a new brand here we're making in HB. Great people making great wares. I'm going to put the link up there. Just spreading the word, you know. We got the City Angels and then we have the SoCal Angels, right? But today we're going to cover all of these crazy vehicles we have heard reported up there in the sky. Now, if you're an OG listener, you know that I've covered this kind of stuff several times. And we're going to go through it in fine detail. Now, before we get started, let's lay it out. What am I talking about? Well, we're talking about the flying triangle, the TR-3B. We're going to be talking about the Tic Tac and the gimbal. We're going to be talking about the propulsion systems in general. We're going to get into a lot of detail on that, so hopefully that's your bag. It's going to be kind of a nerdy UFO episode if you want. Now, personally, I don't think I've ever seen a UFO in my lifetime. And I believe that, a lot of this technology is definitely earthly technology. It is naval, it's naval for some reason. But Navy, if you go back to the Wright brothers, before flight was a thing in the military, the Navy was the one pursuing flight, where you get all those videos of the planes falling off into the water. They were the ones that postponed the patent office from giving the Wright brothers the patent for 4 years, because they had flew like 42 feet in the air, took a photograph in like 1903. I love these little mistakes I make. And they brought it in and, somebody said, nope, can't give it to you. It's impossible. Meanwhile, the military was trying to get it on the site. We have incredible stories by people like Bob Lazar, who talks about, working on the, I keep saying the supermodel, it's the sports model vehicle at S4. So we'll talk about that. We're going to talk about this TR-3B first, because what's interesting about it is that these things sort of creep up in the sightings and things get written down, and the internet didn't exist in a lot of cases when these sightings were first, recorded, at least not the HTTP picture internet that we really started seeing in the mid-90s. And so a lot of stories just come and go, and then we hear about them later, and you have to do a bunch of research, right? And then we know that it's very simple for any group to reverse engineer stories, create photographs, and basically project into the past something that never ever happened, to create something that might be a sort of a little string in the sweater that you're pulling that didn't exist back then. And I want to open this up with a really strange story about Electronic Arts when I used to work there. There's a gentleman who used to work there, and I'll keep his name out of it, but he created a game called Majestic. And Majestic was a game where you put a bunch of contact information into the game, and it was sort of a mental psyop on you. It would call you, it would fax you if you gave it fax, it would email you, it would leave voicemails on your phone, and you were inside of a false narrative, and you knew it. It was like you're joining X-Files, basically. It started off being a real UFO-based, alien-based sort of conspiracy, but it evolved sort of the more darker stuff. But here we have this product on the market for 11 months, and I'll tell you how it worked in just a second. But then 9/11 happens, and it's not cool to have, sort of terrorist things being left on your messages. And so if he had stayed with UFOs, then he probably would have kept the product on the market, and it would have been a nice actual probably escape. But everything got real serious at that point, so it immediately gets canceled because I believe one of the projected covers, or one of the covers that came out, I never saw it physically. My web team helped build all these fake websites, which is part of the mystery. You go search all these fake companies and you're collecting clues. It was an ingenious game, but they had the trade centers, I think in crosshairs or something like that, and it was just bad timing. Okay. So if he had had any knowledge that was going to take place, for instance, he would have never chosen that box cover because it killed a really amazing project. But I'll give you one example of how it worked. The head of games at the time was online, playing games through the web, was getting off the plane in San Francisco, and he knew that the reception in San Francisco was awful. It just was. And he gets off the plane, and his wife is trying to call him, or he's trying to call his wife. or he's told her, hey, give me a buzz. So anyway, the phone rings and he's expecting his wife on the telephone. And instead, he gets a message, a pre-recorded call from Majestic with a screaming woman on the other side of the phone, like she is being murdered on the other side of the phone. I never played the game personally. He starts, he's a very healthy guy, very young guy, but I mean, he's going into the equivalent of like a cardiac arrest of, oh my God, my wife, and his phone goes dead because of the airport. So he's running through the terminal, trying to get outside to get the call to work again. He finds out it's Majestic. So just understand the power of suggestion and the power of controlling history as we go through some of these things. But a lot of these things have been seen by people. And you could say one or two sightings, and some of the sightings are definitely fraudulent. Some of them don't hold up. There'll be, for instance, the TR-3B is a triangle, which I guess we'll jump into, which has typically at least a minimum of 3 lights on all 3 corners of this triangle. It has been witnessed all over the place. Remember my Men in Black episode? A hotel manager was taking out some trash, looked up and saw it fly over the buildings, came inside excited, told everyone, and then the next day, on video, 2 men in black walk in, these gigantic behemoth men with these little tiny heads and these black hats, just like they were out of some Dick Tracy novel. But then they talked to 2 people at the front desk, and these people at the front desk are like, so they had very milky skin. It said their hair looked like it was attached to their hat. Their eyes were the wildest blue, but they just seemed strange people, right? So the TR-3B, initially, the sightings, which we're going to get into, were kind of home videos and pictures. But it's a gigantic triangle, which most people kind of estimate at the size of a football field, which always sounds massive until you do a little bit of research on how big like the B-1 bomber is. If you put that thing right in the center of the football field with wings going out to both end zones, you're almost that big. But, we only see this thing at night, typically. And so you have, obviously, color range from people saying it was pure black to a gray color, dark gray, of course. The other one is that the lights on the corners, they range when people take photographs of it or movies of it. We see it typically as a white color, but most of the people who take the pictures of it see a yellow tone to it. Now, the odd thing about this thing is that the fairly legitimate collection of videos that have been taken of this craft sometimes have a larger, much larger sort of sphere in the center, which is much brighter, of course, because it's much bigger, emitting from the center. So we're going to get into what all these things might be in just a second. But they also say it's absolutely quiet when it flies. And we're going to talk about that as well. But the first time this thing is ever sighted is between 1989 and 1990 in Belgium. And when I say this thing was sighted, we're talking about almost 14,000 people see this thing, or report seeing this thing over Belgium. At that level, you have mass hysteria up to a point, but when you start taking in the locations that people are calling from, people don't talk to people, people are introverted, people are extroverted, people who are tapping into maybe some local news, but this is 89, 90, so you don't have the internet blasting out something on Instagram and everyone falls for it, right? But the police and the military confirm that this thing is up there with radar. So what's interesting about the craft, and you have to remember this because we're going to get into different theories about these craft, and there's a threshold in the mid-90s where the technology, I think, changed drastically. And I think it might be responsible for really mothballing this particular form factor. But radar bounced off of it. And that's something you can't just slide by. But the Belgian Air Force scrambled F-16s to chase this thing. And in the end, no one explained this thing. The Belgian government never came out and said, oh yeah, we called the USA and they're flying their thing over us. The other thing is, if you know where Belgium is, it's sort of in the center of Europe. And so to have any type of U.S. aircraft over there seems like a really strange place to kind of beta test your craft. And we don't have any knowledge of sort of European skunkworks innovation. They typically wait for the U.S. to create something and then they buy a copy of it. For instance, the F-16 is heavily sold over there into Israel. And then we have the F-35s and the 22s. So we have all these different craft that these individuals kind of wait for the U.S. to do. Now, Britain will create something from time to time, but I think categorically the United States and Russia are sort of the top aviation developers. Now, in 1997, I think you have one that is not the TR-3B and probably not even the other boomerang one that's out there. But you had a flying V shape of lights. There was no distinction of the craft. They simply had lights that were shaped like a V, sort of flying over, I think it was Phoenix, and it's called the Phoenix Lights. It's a very famous sighting. But the Air Force claimed that they had dropped flares from A-10 Warthogs, which, maybe, I guess. And that, these flares, but flares actually have a sort of pulsing light frequency that they have as I think they're mostly phosphorus based, so they always burn no matter what happens in the atmosphere. So you can shoot a flare into a storm where it's raining and it will still hang up there and burn on the way down. But it usually has some sort of pulsing light to it. And every time I've ever seen this footage, it's something that's not an aircraft, most likely. Now, chronologically, we're going back to the 80s in Hudson Valley, New York and Connecticut area. We had thousands of people see this thing, once again, saying it moved really slowly, that it hovered, and then it darted away instantaneously. So this is really the first time, prior to the other sightings, we get something that takes off very quickly. Now, the interesting thing about it taking off quickly and being sighted by radar is that most of the theories of the propulsion we're going to talk about tonight will sort of cancel out the radar signature once they start changing the form factor. Creating something in a big triangle might have been something sheerly related to the way that they had to spread out the actual mechanisms that they had figured out to pull this thing off. I personally think this vehicle existed, that it was very U.S. military, or maybe some weird government that's over all of us. But definitely something that Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and perhaps Area 51 worked with. So another sighting was in southern Illinois, here in the United States, around 2000. And this one was reported by police officers, several of them, from different departments. So they were getting their own sightings from their own people, plus the pedestrians were calling in, and they tracked this thing for quite a while. But then again, of course, the FAA and the Air Force deny its existence. Well, in denying an existent aircraft on behalf of yourself is actually fairly simple. Let's say some, genius down the street has got these aircrafts coming out of his backyard. Well, he's a member of a particular street, Maple Street, let's say. And so Maple Street is going to get questioned, do you have this aircraft coming off your street? Well, you and I don't. And so we simply say we don't and he doesn't. And we're the most recognized individuals on Maple Street. But Joey over there is blasting wild vehicles into the sky. So to have the FAA, who doesn't have any jurisdiction over this aircraft, and have the Air Force, who's not a part of, technically, these secret projects, they can both deny it, and they're telling the truth, but it doesn't mean anything, right? Keep that in mind, too. Well, and let's also keep in mind that most aircraft, if you draw a picture, if you take an aircraft and put it on a piece of paper, and I say draw one shape around an aircraft, it's always a triangle, right? So aeronautics likes triangles. So to say that the TR-3B is indicating anything else but itself might be sort of a misnomer. We know the B-2 bomber is very wing-shaped, very triangle-shaped. There's a project Aurora, which is potentially a completely different aircraft, and probably, maybe, doesn't actually use anything but ramjets, the new engines out there, and not some sort of anti-gravity thing. I think anti-gravity is off in its own realm, and because it's so powerful in terms of fighting a war or doing something, it would be utterly devastating to have a craft, fly over to an enemy country, quote unquote, and then drop a bomb and then fly away. It would be instantaneously over, and you wouldn't be able to catch the thing. So keep that in mind too. Now, what's interesting about it is mentioning other foreign countries is that the British have actually reported they have seen officially with their British Air Force that they've seen these crafts, but they didn't know where they came from. So sometimes a really simple report like that says a whole lot more than a bunch of, executives rushing in from various agencies denying the existence of something. All you need is your uncle to literally say, look, I looked up, I was on guard duty, I was driving something from point A to point B, and this thing was in the sky. Didn't have a camera on me. It was 1985, didn't have cell phones with 4K cameras on it, but I saw it. And again, I'm going to remind you of a story that my buddy Richard Taylor said. His father, I think, passed away somewhere in the 70s or 80s, and when he did, he was a test pilot back in the 40s, doing very covert test pilot stuff. And he said that, well, first he's dying in the hospital. So he's got his daughter and his son there who are grown adults with kids. And he says, I want, the daughter to leave the room. And so she leaves the room and she's kind of like, well, whatever, my brother's going to tell me what he says anyway. But he gets my buddy Richard, and he says, son, he goes, I just want you to know before I go that when I was up there flying in the olden days, we had 30-foot discs come up to our craft in the middle, of the night. We're traveling as fast as we possibly can in these vehicles that can't turn. And it had strobing lights around the perimeter of a disc. And he goes, we have no idea what these things were. We thought they were going to get in the way and crash us, but they didn't. But they were literally playing with us like little kids. So just put that in your bag. My buddy's father did not lie to his son. I assure you of that. And he felt so strongly about it might spook his daughter. He had her walk out of the room. And who knows, some people do react badly to things, right? Now, the other thing about these vehicles is that sometimes they'll be put in fictional things, television shows, maybe a movie or something like that, mostly television shows. And when you see it in a fictional realm, it starts to cancel itself out of your non-fictional realm. Because you're like, I saw it on TV. It's that thing, right? Oh, yeah, whatever. It was on X-Files or whatever. It was on this other show. It might behoove you to consider that these things actually exist and that they're simply being put in those shows because people just like yourself and myself are writers. And they just say, wouldn't it be cool to add a little spice to this story? And I'm sure if you're trying to hide a clandestine secret project, right, that you would love to have disinformation out there or something just to kind of blur the lines between reality and fiction, right? Now, what's interesting about this whole thing and our government, I can only talk about the United States, let's just say, in case you don't live in the United States. If we did develop something like this, and other departments are not in a need-to-know compartment, and then other agencies go to the Senate and say nothing exists like this, or we have no evidence that this stuff exists, that's sort of a benefit to those who are trying to hide this innovation, isn't it? So if you say, well, I know that stuff isn't real because the Navy said it's fake and the Air Force said it's fake and other agencies said it was fake, you, again, might be hearing a truthful statement from an organization that is not directly involved. And you have to always look at the fine print of those claims because it is a division of. And so the idea that you're going to get some report from some totally top secret division is negligible. You're never going to have them weigh in. They're not going to go to a Senate hearing, maybe an intelligence briefing, but not a Senate hearing where it's televised to the world. So now let's move on to Aurora, because I think we're going to get rid of a couple projects that were more 80s and 90s projects than 21st century projects. And we're going to talk about the potential change in the propulsion system, which might have mothballed or at least segregated the two development projects. I think the TR-3B doesn't need to physically exist anymore because we've seen things like the Tic Tac and the gimbal, which we're going to get into, which I think is the new form factor, at least experimental form factor. So in 1985, the name Aurora appeared in the U.S. defense budget as a $455 million black aircraft production. So the Aurora was said to be a cover story for the B-2 bomber. But I think that the visual evidence of a flying sort of jet propulsion type vehicle shaped like a triangle has been recorded a lot more often than this TR-3B thing, which is sort of in the UFO Men in Black kind of category. I have seen several videos where it's dusk and one of these things is landing at one of the air bases. And so we speculate really quickly as to what this means. But if you followed any type of popular science or popular mechanics magazines in the 80s and 90s and early 20th century, before all these magazines kind of tanked, they were talking about vehicles that were traveling, from Mach 3 to Mach, I think, 11 and 13. And really what that means is a huge innovation in the aerodynamics and propulsion systems such that if they can find a shape that cuts down dramatically the amount of friction that a hull is going to run into on an airship, and they get to another level of propulsion, which is then exponentially more powerful, then within a small iteration of time, you've got a vehicle that goes amazingly fast. However, there might be limitations to a vehicle being anything other than a surveillance vehicle versus something that can drop a bomb or something. Because in order to drop a bomb, you are going to have to change the shape of the vehicle to let a bomb out of the hull. You also can have an object slightly attached to this vehicle traveling at those speeds such that when it's releasing a bomb, the bomb is pushing against the vehicle and the vehicle just explodes at those levels. So a lot of this would be high atmospheric surveillance on the ground using crazy optics on the ground. But I would actually suggest that at those speeds, the entire optical system has to be re-optimized for flying that quickly. And you're going to have some sort of digital technology, which is now not a big deal. But imagine trying to use film. What kind of shutter speed do you have to have if you were going, say, Mach 10? I know things are far away and they seem a little more stable when they're far away. But a little bit of blur when you're trying to read a newspaper on the ground is going to be completely devastating to the intel you're trying to grab. So in 1989, a guy named Chris Gibson, was working on an oil rig. And he said he basically saw what he thought was a KC-135, which is a big refueling tanker up in the sky, refueling something that was triangular up there with the F-111s up there escorting the whole event. Very interesting, right? Now, with the Aurora, you have a very distinct difference between that and the TR-3B. The Aurora puts out a pulse engine burst. So you have many recordings online of what really sounds like the V1 buzz bomb. The V1 buzz bomb was an amazing craft that was burping out its propellant in a sort of pulsing manner. So you would hear the V1 come. And the V1 was not like the V2. The V2s are rockets. The V1 was a winged aircraft with this pulsing engine in it that pushed it really quickly. It was like a bomb drone, basically, right? So imagine advancing that technology up another 40, 50 years and refining it to the point where there's something very natural about the frequency pushing out the back. The other thing is that the exhausts, which left, contrails, were shaped like donuts. So some folks would hear it, rush outside. The vehicle's already gone because it moves very quickly, but they look at the trail in the sky and they're like, wow, these are like weird aftershock donuts all lined up in the sky. And of course, it's only a few seconds before it gets dispersed, right? So the Royal Air Force in 1993 had a gentleman, Captain Tom Ellis. He described the pulsing engine first officially so that everybody could kind of write that one down. In 1991 and 1992, here in Southern California, they were basically reporting what they called sonic booms or skyquakes, where they were just hearing this crazy signature in the sky. The other day, we had a sonic boom, which they said was a SpaceX boom, and I was sitting in a garage watching baseball, smoking a cigar. We actually had just put the door down because it was getting kind of chilly out, and the entire house just had one big pop, which is sort of strange because when I saw the space shuttle come in, it was a double bam. So I don't know why sometimes you get a double concussive blast or one. When I heard the SR-71 leave Port Hueneme to fly to New York on its last voyage, just before I moved north, I believe that was a double bang, and that was, they're just a weird thing. It shocks your entire house. And in a minute, you'll know why they would never, when you hear one, I should say, you'll know why they could never let them happen over residential houses. Any type of old glass is going to blow up instantaneously, but it would freak out everyone, okay? Now, there's out there who are UFO hunters, and they use a lot of radio to listen to, aircraft flying over and their call signs. And they have noted hearing about a call sign called gas pipe, which doesn't match, I guess, any designated thing that they would ever be recording. So they're basically saying, not sure what gas pipe means, but it might be something related to, one of these craft having a wild call sign. In 1994, out of Area 51, a guy named Chuck Clark said he filmed at a Groom Lake on February of 1994, a triangular-shaped vehicle taking off, which I completely believe. And again, unless you're talking about a craft that goes straight up, that would be more of our TR-3B technology versus the Aurora that would take off and simply slowly climb to a really high atmosphere where it's starting to thin out, and then they change engines from what you would need in a thicker atmosphere to the sort of ramjets that they openly talk about it now, right? Now, the distinction, because the claim is pretty consistent that Aurora was the code name for the B-2 bomber. It very well might have been, but the interesting consistency with all the magazines and all the individuals, and, believe it or not, these magazines do know people within skunkworks organizations, which are trying to scare the bad guys, quote unquote bad guys, right? And so they do put out rumors about technology. It might be they're putting out rumors that are false simply to scare the other folks, but it's not a smart idea to tell your enemy, who's fairly scientifically apt, that you have a craft that's traveling at 13 Mach, such that they might try to create something like that. And if you don't want to spend a tremendous amount of money, let's say that you're like, oh, well, Russia in the 90s was completely broke because the USSR failed. They had no money to chase this. And if they did, it could have been a bankrupt mechanism like we did with the moon missions, right? We bankrupt them trying to get there. Maybe. But you're running a huge gamble that through sheer serendipity, because if you don't know there's a problem, you don't know there's a problem. But if you do know, and you start researching, then you might actually run into technology that didn't exist before, simply because you felt like there was a need. And if you start rumoring about technology that isn't quite worked out in your own realm, meaning you haven't perfected this technology, but you're sort of putting out the thread in the sweater that if you study this type of technology, you might get to Mach. And then you have all of the writers here in the United States taking care of magazine articles, adding their own speculative DNA, calling professors up and theoretical scientists up to add more DNA to it. Now, the military may not have any of that technology in their compartmentalization projects, but they're shoveling it over to the perceived enemy to then use it as a basis for potentially finding the solution to these problems, right? I just think it's a silly game to play. But of course, after that, we got scramjets. And again, these are engines that are fully declassified now. Not exactly how they work and how they're installed and how their signatures are masked, but we are seeing sort of the SR-71, which was said to have started flying in the early 60s, and it doesn't get mothballed until 89. Of course, it went through some iterations. Some folks have suggested that these are merely the SR-72 projects where they're coming up with the next thing. The idea that the United States, and this was heavily theorized and publicized in 89 when they said they got rid of the SR-71, which apparently is still flying, by the way. They said that you would never mothball something if you didn't have a replacement for it. And there was nothing like the SR-71, which could fly at Mach 3. So again, you take Mission Impossible and you see these wild jets up there. I think we easily have something up there that at least is comparable, and probably the propulsion systems are completely different. But now the other thing is that between 1985 and 1995, before they realized that they probably should keep this all completely covert, the budgets for the military black projects were pretty exposed. So when they started writing checks into these organizations, It'd get publicized. People could find out, and senators were there. So I speculate now that the senators are definitely aware of what they're voting on. It's just not something that's made public, especially probably since the turn of the century, right? Now, before we get into the Tic Tac and the gimbal, let's talk about a transition of technology. Why would the TR-3B, the triangle, have 3 lights on each corner? Well, don't laugh, but when we talk about what Bob Lazar talks about with S4 and working with the sports model craft, whether or not he's telling the truth or not, what he talks about actually makes a tremendous amount of sense. Now, again, the gentleman I worked for who did a bunch of futuristic movie designs for years, he would have people come to him and brag about technology. And it seems that they were talking about stuff they weren't supposed to be talking about. So, a couple more months passes and he talks to me and tells me what they say. Now, they would never reveal like current technology by any means, but they were definitely high on talking about the transition of technology. And one of the things that they told him was that by 1986, they had a huge epiphany of technological advancement. Now, how many of you see the brilliance of moving from albums, cassette tapes, CDs to RAM-based music players? And then now streaming over the internet. Can you see the brilliance in the whole thing? What happened to LPs? And a lot of us love LPs and the warmth and sound it has, but they got scratched. Cassettes get damaged, they warp. CDs got scratched, right? When they moved from blue lasers to red lasers and they took a $500 player down to $2, then scratches made a difference again, right? And then, your little player, your little iTouch or whatever, well, the batteries run out on the thing and it doesn't have enough storage and you have to constantly load it up with stuff. So just get it online, right? Through your favorite app on your phone. But the big mechanical difference between old technology and new technology is always moving parts versus stationary design. So you saw this in the first Marvel movie, which was actually kind of funny, and this is not an old thing. If you were to take mercury, the liquid mercury, the silver kind of liquid mercury, and you put it in a torus, which is a donut, and you spin it around, it starts creating an electrical field instantaneously. All you have to do is figure out a way to spin it in a torus. You could start it with your finger and have a voltage meter, and you'll start to see, even a little bowl, they'll start projecting out electromagnetic energy. And it's because it is disturbing the fabric of the universe in such a way, it's immediately a power source. So one of the things that my buddy was told in 1996, in the 21st century, just past the 21st century, was by 1996 they had gotten rid of this torus mechanism and had gone to a solid state mechanism. Okay, that's a big deal. So imagine the TR-3B, which has got a lot of sightings in the 80s and the early 90s, is a form factor that is using, via the center piece that you saw, some sort of spinning torus. Once you get rid of the need for that level of moving mechanism, and you're moving the corners way out to the edge, away from that center source, because you have an electromagnetic field that might interfere with these things you have on the corners, which might be some form of sort of gravity well system. Now, whether or not anyone's achieved some antimatter engine is really unnecessary. But the glowing colors that you see on the corners could merely be the electromagnetic field that's coming off of them. Why do you see them, and why would they be exposed, especially down to the ground, where an enemy could say, look at that thing, we got a problem, send a missile up to hit it? Well, it has to be exposed, because if it's not, it might disrupt the entire flying capability of the vehicle itself. The centerpiece comes and goes in some of these sightings, and it seems like the later the sighting, that centerpiece is missing. Could be they're onto a much better catalyst system, which we're going to get into. Hopefully I won't lose you guys, that could generate this field. But imagine you start spending money trying to keep that triangle thing going because it simply has an established project. It has a line item in some Black Ops project. You can still just get the renewed money from Congress or whatever, Senate, instead of having to apply for a new project and sell them on a new idea. And so you keep trying to retrofit this thing to the point where it just gets silly. Why try to keep the triangle alive? It doesn't really work that well. And it's viewable by radar. Interesting, right? Because once we're going to get into this Tic Tac technology, we're switching complete paradigms over to what either is the true UFO technology that maybe Roswell's situation revealed, or some other craft we've found or captured or what have you, or had given to us, right? But when you start getting to the new propulsion systems, radar is not going to work anymore, no matter how big this thing is. At least it shouldn't. So I think most of you have heard about the Tic Tac. The Tic Tac story is really strange because I have heard so many different versions of this story, it's almost hard to keep track of it. But at a minimum, in 2004, this is the claim. Our Air Force scrambled to chase what was a 40-foot white pill-shaped vehicle. Now, 40 feet is a big vehicle. Let's just think about a 40-foot boat. That's pretty huge. And it was pretty fat, it wasn't some really long, thin thing. Now, before I go on, one of the changes in the story and some of the videos I've seen, which I don't know if they're AI generated or whatever, was saying that there was a bunch of them flying around and that they descended from 80,000 feet to almost sea level instantaneously. And that's when they popped up in some visual for our pilots to see, our Top Gun pilots, right? Commander David Fravor, I don't know how to say his name, Fravor, was one of the folks that said he saw it in the front-looking infrared. So the interesting thing about the front-looking infrared is that the general principle of this FLIR is that it just simply has to be hotter than the environment that it's in. That's all it has to be in order to show up on this thing. And so if you're a human being and you're running around in the desert, they can look down at you and you're going to shine like a bright coin because you're at a different temperature than the environment that you're in. You're either way less than the heat because they can reverse it, or you're way hotter because you might be in the wilderness in the wintertime. But they said it made this descent in 1 second. It wasn't there and it was there. Now, what's strange about it is I didn't hear about them finding it 80,000 feet in the air and then suddenly making it down. So I don't know how they know the differential in a drop. But these F-18s, started looking at the thing. Now, I'm pretty sure this is a United States creation or some other government. Let's just say that much. It's a man-made creation. I think it's flying over water for one very specific reason. If it fails, it falls into water. Thus, it can be rescued. Now, I don't know what happens if you push it down into the water. The propulsion system we're about to talk about would actually insulate it from water as well, but maybe not forever. Who knows? Then the USS Roosevelt encounters the gimbal in 2015. And they're saying it was probably off the coast of Florida because they look up where the USS Roosevelt spent most of its time during that year. And it's not declassified as to exactly where it was, but whatever. It's over water. Okay. Now, part of this would also be to run a test. What would our pilots do serendipitously seeing this? I mean, we're not going to tell them and it's going to show up. And other times it would be, we're scrambling them to go chase this thing and let's just see what happens. And obviously they hopefully would have run tests to make sure you're never going to catch this thing. Don't even worry about it. And from one commander to another, it's like, is it going to get our boys killed? Nah, but let's see what they do. Other than just a sheer mistake in flying, maybe two craft bang into each other, which is pretty hard to do with all of our radar. Let's just see how they fare through this whole thing. But the interesting thing about the Tic Tac, which is pill-shaped, is they said the gimbal was more saucer-shaped, but it really looked like a spinning top. And it was holding in place, but it was also rotating kind of slowly. And most of you have seen the videos, which are obviously horrible videos, instead of showing us like the most photoreal images of these vehicles. And there's a few online, but then a lot of 3D artists got involved and tried to piece together what was said by the pilots to kind of come up with some 3D, impersonation of it. But the gimbal was actually reported as being also a fleet of these things. There was a bunch of them that showed up. Now, the odd thing about this whole thing being potentially an ET and not one of our own craft would be A couple things. One, if you're going to make a big show of force or a big presence here, to not follow that up with some sort of formal contact is a bit strange. Well, let's just go down and freak them out and come back. It's a lot like a Douglas Adams novel when that happens. But to also say, okay, it's a U.S. created object, and they're going to deploy a fleet of these things that are flying all over the place at amazing speeds, zapping in and out of view. Well, you have to coordinate that somehow. And your communication protocol has to be something that's most likely not radio waves to get communication to all these vehicles. And you have to coordinate them probably with some central computer so they don't bang into each other. Or it's some formational flying thing that is pre-recorded. But the problem with pre-recording all of the flying patterns is that if some aircraft from the United States has been scrambled to chase these things, which the Red Rippers were a squadron that was sent out supposedly to chase these things down, you can't have one show up in the middle of a vehicle, slam into a wing, scare the living crap out of a pilot such that he does a maneuver to get somebody killed. Now, the other thing is, if someone got killed, would they tell us? You never know, right? Could be a training exercise problem, right? Now, they typically call these kind of things like a field test, right? We're going to field test the craft in a real environment and see what happens, and then we'll just gather the data up. Part of it is to figure out what they might need to tell our folks in order to get along with these vehicles in the theater of war. But the other one is to figure out, well, even though our enemies may not even speak our own language, our language, we'll at least have some instincts about kind of how they might react to this kind of thing happening in their field. And how can we confuse them? So take the algorithm in the opposite direction to really mess them up. And again, to me, after seeing drone technology used in the Ukrainian war, if you could put a vehicle on over a target and simply just drop stuff out of it, if that's possible without disturbing the field, then the enemy would be done very quickly. It would be almost an unfair war, wouldn't it? If not formally an unfair war. Now, the interesting thing about this, because we're about to go into the anti-gravity engines here, is that you don't have the typical paradigm of aircraft, right? Aircraft, as it's typically sold to us, is either propeller power or jet power. And then you have all of these different, wing structures that change shape to create lift, to create drop, to create resistance during landing. And so if you think in that kind of realm, this anti-gravity technology wipes that whole thing out. It's like an electric car versus a combustion engine car, right? Things go wrong in combustion engine cars. You got to replace fuel pumps and all this other stuff, belts and spark plugs and injectors and all this other kind of stuff. Well, you don't have valves and spark plugs in an electrical engine. It's just gets an update through the internet, and you go to lunch while your car is like making all kind of servo noises and stuff for 20 minutes. It's undrivable while it's updating all the motors. It's a very simple process, getting rid of a lot of moving parts. Now, as we go into the anti-gravity system, which I've talked about several times on the show, but we haven't really broken it down in a really practical manner where human beings are going to be actually participating in its creation. The basis of the technology is actually so simple, it's almost ridiculous. Now, easier said than done is going to be the mantra of this technology. One, you need a pretty good power source, right? You're going to have who knows how much power to create what's going to be a electromagnetic field around the vehicle itself. And that's going to give it all of its maneuverability. One of the other benefits you get of creating this particular type of electromagnetic field is you get an encapsulation of the occupants inside. Now, I don't think the gimbal or the Tic Tacs, whether it be one or many, have human beings inside them. Maybe, but I doubt it. It would be interesting. But inside that vehicle, you could have an egg on a pillow, and you could send it off and bring it back after massive maneuvers, and that thing won't have moved a single iota inside. The only time it would ever maybe move is when the field turns off and the vehicle kind of relaxes into whatever, landing gear it's got, and then it might wiggle a little bit. That's about it. But that thing going 8,000 miles an hour and turning around going the opposite direction all day long until the power source needs to be recharged, if it does, it's going to be fine inside. And that's the way this works. Now, what's not apparent yet But I've been dealing with this notion since, I think, 2016, when I first did my, how to build a UFO episode, where I talked about potentially creating sort of a Faraday type fabric around the outside of a particular vehicle. And I personally think that saucer shapes are actually fantastic for slicing through the atmosphere. But what I eventually realized was it's probably a shape more aerodynamic when you need it, but it also is perfect for holding the contents that creates this system. A center area where you have a solid state mechanism that catalyzes into your engines that basically can perform this task of creating this field of energy around the vehicle. Now, on this channel, we believe that gravity is a push, not a pull, because pull is phenomenon technology and phenomenon and science shouldn't be in the same sentence together, right? You should know how your stuff works. But again, when you go back to Faraday through Tesla, they were using the ethereal model of pressurization on things. And what they tried to do in the 21st or 20th century was to get rid of the ethereal model, but then they kind of substitute in quantum fields to because they're getting to a point where they got to start explaining certain things that we're discovering. So the only thing you need to know is that you're being pushed down to the earth, not pulled down to the earth. If you go with a different model, then a lot of this technology wouldn't work at all. And because we think we've seen it, and it scientifically was being taught in colleges all the way up to the mid-60s. I used to have a lecture I used to watch on YouTube, which is long gone now, where a guy was teaching on a blackboard in the 60s about this entire electromagnetic field and using a saucer-shaped vehicle to explain it. Of course, he didn't have Lazar's thing. But what is electricity in the first place, right? I just told you if you spun mercury in a donut, a torus, it just starts generating electricity. Many of you have probably seen the videos bounce around Tic Tac, Telegram, Instagram, something like that. And it's a very real thing. But now imagine you have a magnet that attaches to your refrigerator. Well, it's a very structured, crystallized element that is basically organizing its electromagnetic field such that it can hang on to something. Now, I said it completely wrong in one of my recent episodes where I said element 215 is Bob Lazar's element. It's element 115, not 215. I put it in the video, a big correction. Unfortunately, in audio, I'm not into recording excerpts and talking over myself. But 115 is an interesting theory, regardless if it exists and whether or not we had a particle of it, I think in 2003 for a split second in some accelerator, but we didn't have a coin of it, right? And Bob Lazar laments that he has a little piece of 115 somewhere stored in his presence, which would be worth billions of dollars, considering we haven't officially above board created this stuff. But he had talked about the fact that aliens had given human beings 100 pounds of this stuff. Whatever. But I think that you could most likely engineer something that through understanding magnetism, you could create something where you have opposing fields pushed really close together, potentially bonded together through some mechanism. And then what you have is a constant field coming off of this element. A constant field, the wheel that's in Crystal Castle. He had, I think 244 magnets or something like that, all held together with cement. Each one of the magnets was reversed in polarity as they were stacked up on each other. I assume that he would lay down a little bit of concrete, then put the first ones in, then lay down another piece of concrete. The other ones can't move, and somehow he's getting this thing to work. But what that did was that stimulated a field that generated a capacitation into copper coils he had on both sides of the wheel. So he'd wind that wheel, charge those capacitors. Most likely had to put some cover on them so it didn't touch them, just like the back of an old TV. For those of you who don't remember old TVs, if you ever plugged your TV in, then unplugged it, then took the back off the TV, and the back of that tube was a big giant copper coil. And if you touched that thing, you were a former human being, okay? But the goal would be, within your engine, is to create some sort of siphon. And you're going to have different anomalies at different stages of flying the vehicle. In sea level atmosphere, you're going to have to provide a lot more energy to get this thing to work, because nothing necessarily would work with you in a very non-interference manner. You're going to have a lot of different elements in the atmosphere working against your vehicle. But the higher and higher you were to get, a lot of the atmosphere is starting to thin out, and now you're dealing with potentially electromagnetic field that actually protects the Earth. And this is where we have the huge paradigm shift between something like the TR-3B. and something that's a lot more solid state. We're going from a phonographic record right into RAM memory, right? We're getting into stuff that's 100% configurable. And just like everything mechanical, the size of the vehicle, the size of the engines, and the size of this potentially catalyzing substance, which I guess in Bob Lazar's case would be element 115. It's actually a brilliant idea. For those of you who never listened to Bob Lazar talk about this, I'll just cover in a couple sentences. He says that they take this element 115, which has never been stabilized in above board chemistry of any kind, and they've got it down to some sort of solid stuff, and they hone it out into a cone upside down. Then they slice two sides of the cone, and they put that inside of a mechanism that then stimulates this internal wave down into 3 antimatter engines. And he explains how they route the antimatter to get it to work. But then with just 3 engines on little spindles underneath the vehicle, they can turn in unison and create the field around the vehicle such that you want to go right, we create a little bit of a gravity well to the right. Remember that push theory we talked about? Well, if you can move that atmosphere or move that ethereal force out of the way, then what's going to happen? Well, it's going to be pushing on the right side and you're going to go left. Well, if you want to go right, you simply push that field out on the right, and then left side pushes you, and it's all a natural process. You have no inertia anymore. You're essentially canceling the mass as it relates to everything that used to perform gravity on you. And so now you can go wherever you want to go. The only difference is you have to perform the amount of energy to move whatever's around you out of the way. Now, a lot of you have seen the superconductors that are chilled down, put on a Mobius strip of magnets, and then they can push it and it goes around forever and it's floating. And they call that quantum locking. These vehicles are essentially quantum locking into the atmosphere. When they move through space, either oxygen or water or whatever, I don't know if they can get through granite or something like that, but certainly liquid-based substrates, the air would actually go completely around the vehicle and reconfigure underneath, potentially, hopefully, exactly the way it was before the vehicle arrived. So when you talk about Bill Cooper seeing vehicles jam into the ocean in, I think, 1967, water's very resistant, right? I was a lifeguard back in the 80s, and one of the things they taught us was that they want to teach us about water resistance. And they said if they were to lay out a bunch of fresh newspapers on the water and you were to jump off the 10-foot diving board and lock your knees and hit a newspaper that's freshly laid out, it would break both your legs. That's how much resistance water can give you. So jamming a vehicle, and even if it's shaped like a razor blade, it's still going to resist you doing that unless it has enough electromagnetic force, which would be a lot more than oxygen, to move water out of the way. But now there's a couple other attributes about this. That electromagnetic field around your vehicle most likely will start creating photonic waves, light. And depending on what frequency and what you're trying to do, it might have a yellow hue to it. It might have an orange hue to it. There's a very strange anomaly going around where people have seen this glowing orange ball in the sky. Now, it could be a ball. It could be the Tic Tac pill, but they're only able to see it, from its rear end or its front end. But I went back to Kansas about 5 years ago, and I went on my reunion, and I met an old man at a bar, a great guy named Charlie, who's since passed. Got a good photograph of he and I together. And he told me, he was like, we're just messing around talking. And he said, I said, where do you live? And it was only when I asked him where he lived. He goes, well, I live outside of town. He gave me the street. I don't remember where it was. South of town. And he goes, the other day, because he finished what he was saying, and he goes, man, the other day I was sitting on my porch, and he goes, this orange sphere came over my house, flying up over my house and out down the wilderness. And he goes, this thing was so bright. He goes, I could have read a newspaper. And he goes, then 2 fighter jets are chasing the thing. And they all go out of view, which in Kansas, that's a long view, man. That's probably 60 to 100 miles away before you can't see the sky. Someone's up high, you can see it for quite a while. And then he goes, it came back the other direction. And he said the jets were gone. But he goes, this thing was moving super duper fast, performing kind of movements, was not apparently aware of his existence or didn't care about his existence, so wasn't any kind of toying with his vision. But this thing's been seen in England. It's been seen in Texas, all over the place. And it was seen in England to the early 80s. There's a video out there all about it we put on our Telegram channel. But you have to scroll way back on it. But that orange hue that's coming off that thing most likely is whatever the energy signature is for that particular shape, that particular size, glows orange. The other thing is there wouldn't be any sonic booms from this stuff doing anything, because it's basically returning all the matter it's displacing behind it back the way it was. So you don't have a differential. You simply, in terms of mass, don't exist in the universe when you would have this field around you, because you're canceling yourself out of the universe. The thing I've told you guys several times, if you were to truly create an isolating field such that the outer universe couldn't come inside the vehicle, you might dissipate in existence instantaneously. But I think that would be nearly impossible to do with our energy sources today. Now, the other thing to consider is that we have a lot of energy in the universe. The whole thing is energy, right? So if you learn how to tap into the overall energy that is in our atmosphere, that is flowing towards Earth, that creates that push on you, and if you could get up into something like the Van Allen belts, for instance, you might have a problem that you have so much electricity your vehicle would vaporize if you didn't have a very strong Faraday type fabric around your vehicle. Remember, Faraday cages only work if the frequency that's coming at you is solid, is consistent. So if they start varying the frequency and varying the amplitude of anything coming at you, Faraday cages don't work. And that's why you'll buy a Faraday bag for your telephone, put your phone in it, and it's still getting messages, because the Wi-Fi router in your house is not a constant frequency. Neither is the cell towers, neither is any other technology. So in terms of protecting yourself from that sort of thing, you would be better being under concrete. You'd be better being under a very thick layer of water in order to really protect yourself from that kind of stuff. You could build a bed with like six inches of water around you. You would probably live in a fairly RF-proof area, right? But now the interesting thing about a skin that actually keeps a lot of the natural energy away from your interior of your vehicle using some total substrate that's going to create a nice Faraday cage on a nano level, is that you could actually take that skin and shape it in a particular way that you could allow in when you wanted to. You could change the shape of the vehicle and allow an induction to happen, where you would actually allow some of the outer energy that's being created to create this field around your vehicle to go back inside the vehicle. You could do it for two reasons. One, you could create sort of, for any of you who understand turbos, it's unspent gasoline, basically vapors that go back into the engine and get refired. That's why the Soviet Union's boosters were so much better than ours back in '72, is they had actually figured out how to do that recycling of energy, that reuse of energy on a rocket engine. Well, the same thing goes for any type of power source whatsoever. Any extraneous fuel, which in our case would be electrons that have either already performed their task or they're readily available because you're in a part of the atmosphere where it's natural, or you have it so sensitive that you can grab it out of the atmosphere, you could route that into your vehicle to create the very propulsion you're looking for. But again, down at sea level, you might have to use a completely different technology to get higher up, where you're starting to get out of the muddy atmosphere that is, oxygen on our surface of our existence, right? Now let's take a pause from the actual specifics of the whole thing of how it might work, as vague as that might have been. And let's go over to the theory of this technology has existed in one way or another. And let's say you have 2 or 3 decades to play with it. So I'm going to give you a funny analogy. Any of you have ever seen the movie Star Wars, especially the first one, and you see the Millennium Falcon take off out of the cantina when the stormtroopers are setting up their tripods trying to blast them out of the sky, right? You see a vehicle lift, turn, rotate, and take off. And you see that back panel of the Millennium Falcon is glowing blue, which honestly perfectly works with what we've talked about today. But you look at that vehicle and all the other sci-fi vehicles that you've ever seen that have anti-gravity, not the Space 1999 one, which uses like normal rocket engines, but something that's really using some anti-gravity mechanism. as science fiction as you want to get. Well, the first thing that you think about subconsciously, if not consciously, is, wow, look at that. That's what a ship could look like if the engine itself was just like whatever. Or let's just put that old X-22 engine in there and it'll take us off, right? Well, we've had multiple soldiers report vehicles landing, black military folks without any really designation of country, American English-speaking soldiers getting out of them and yelling at the soldiers who have found UFOs because they were just coincidentally called out to recover a crashed vehicle, not knowing it was a UFO, like the one in Chile. So imagine taking that to an RV level, right? Well, let's put a refrigerator in there. Let's get some sleeping cat. How big can we make this thing go? As big as we want. We just have to make the power. So okay, I got you. Putting command centers in these kind of things. What's really interesting about the theory that some sort of government that doesn't have a name on it, having this technology and potentially pushing it to a level of use where it's very livable, is that we definitely don't see any indication in all the little squabbles we got going on in the world right now that any of that technology has ever been used in war. Almost like there's we got it, but we would never use it in war. Because if we did that and they ever got filmed and the devastation was insane, then we would get in trouble, basically, with the rest of the world, whoever that might be who has that technology. But the other thing is we know a lot of negative things in conventional war are happening every day somewhere in the world, and no one's stopping it. So there must be, if that technology does exist and it's been moved into whatever agencies that have it, they're not authorizing its use to stop the insanity. I mean, how nice would it be to have all the drones over Ukraine just absolutely EMP'd to death? And you guys are going to have to go home. We're going to get a piece of paper out. That's how we're going to solve this particular dispute, right? Now, the other one that I didn't put a lot of research into tonight, but I've definitely talked about in the past, is the bizarre sort of octopus thing that's flown over a couple military bases that typically are right on the coast of the United States. So it's always got water very close by in case there's any issues. For me personally, the videos look completely fraudulent. The vehicle in question is very nebulous. It's not fully opaque, meaning you can see through the thing. All the footage I've seen, you can see through it. There's never any really good footage of it where you have just a normal surveillance camera built in the last 20 years taking a photograph of this thing with any features on it or what have you. So for me, I don't know why that was ever distributed by even a military agency, but they have like cameras on this thing for a really long time and a couple different sightings, but never a good color photograph. Every human being has a 4K camera now. It's called their phone. And the idea that we have this 4K camera on our telephones is 20 years ago would be utterly inconceivable that a 12-year-old child would have a 4K camera. There were cameras, the XR, was it the XL1? It was like 480p. Boy, that was like a $3,000 camera back in the day. There's no excuse for not getting some of this stuff recorded in vivid, detail. Now, the other problem that we've got is we've got apps on telephones now which will insert UFOs into your shot. It finds your view, it stabilizes on a horizon, so you move your phone all around and the thing stays pretty stable. But it has some anomalies in it. One of the funny TR3B sightings recently was a kid using that on his telephone, trying to make it off like it was really something he was actually seeing. But the other odd thing that I know that a lot of you know is that when SpaceX does a ton of their launches, and I see them all the time over California, there's a fuel that comes off this thing that's glowing in the sky, and it's spraying all this junk all over us. I think the biggest joke would be is if that stuff coming off the rocket is nothing more than a slow poison for human beings. So we're all like so excited we see it, and then we get cancer, right? Or it explodes on the tarmac. It just blasts an area, a whole zone of a particular state of Texas, and everyone's going to get sick eventually. But it's a slow sick, so it's okay, right? But when you see this thing, there's videos out there where the boosters come off and they're supposedly landing back down the ground, and people think they're seeing UFOs. I think a lot of us thought that in the 80s that we'd get more educated about what we were seeing as it moved into the 21st century, and how wrong we were, that now a ton of deep fake stuff and a ton of AI stuff, no one even knows the difference between what's real and what's not real. So they've really pushed the agencies that make this kind of technology have migrated society through social media platforms into a perfect place where they don't know what they're seeing. They're being gaslit, right? See a bunch of fake stuff, and then there's a couple real things. I saw recently today, someone posted one of the very convincing sort of autopsy video or autopsy photographs of a pretty bulbous head looking alien. And you know what's wild about that is it could be a real photograph, but how would we know? We've seen so many movies with that stuff, and there's so many super talented people, and there's AI that can generate it just by asking it to. Midjourney's, I've used it, several times on the show. I use it to create thumbnails. And boy, if you're not really astute and understand visual effects in 3D and just look for things, it'd be hard for you to know that it's not real. But recently, and I don't want to get into any type of current event topic, so save your breath in the comments, but our B-2 bombers were supposedly used recently here in June of 2025. A 36-hour journey, maybe minimal effectiveness, who knows? But it's not a Tic Tac doing it. It's not a gimbal doing it. It's not some TR-3B doing it. It's not something where it's like, well, nothing took off, and I don't know why your place exploded. If you had these vehicles in the theater of war, there would be pretty much a categorical success in every single substrate that you could possibly itemize, right? But you don't. You still have the normal old stuff. And just kind of wrapping up here, what's interesting for those of us, and I'm assuming you're in this group too, who have spent a tremendous amount of your life watching UFO specials on TV, especially when the internet became available in the the late 90s, early 20th century. A lot of photos were up there that are very hard to find now. But we saw all these, farmers taking shots of what looks like hubcaps being thrown in the air or some mechanical piece of an axle of some truck. And, these photos get looked at by experts according to the television shows that are selling you ads in between the commercial breaks. And we've had a significant reduction in that kind of reporting, haven't we? I mean, you would have someone come up with the design of a ship, pitch something in the sky, take a picture of it. As soon as that picture lands in the United States, it takes a few months, and someone else creates a very similar vehicle, throws that in the sky, takes a photograph. Oh, now we've seen it in two different locations. We don't see that stuff as much anymore. But we still have sort of anomalies of history. I went and did this will be a fun little conclusion. I did a little dive on the cigar-shaped UFOs that my grandmother said she saw. And again, I just said this recently. She's born in 1912. So she said she was seeing these things by 1920. And again, blimp technology sort of existed, but, that's really early for blimp technology to be at some level. Now, what she said was, and again, just to recap, she told me this very late in her life, one of the last physical visits I had with her. She's full on healthy. But she said it to me, and then she had this look on her face like, don't think I'm crazy. And she wasn't remotely a tall tale person at all. But then I went and looked up all these different sightings of these things, and it mostly starts in the 30s, which is 20 years past, more than almost 1933 or something, I think was one of the first official sightings of one of these things. And you're getting so close to like the Hindenburg and other vehicles existing that wouldn't have been a big deal. But what my grandmother said was it was silent. There were multiple of them at any one sighting, and they had a little puffy cloud coming out of the back of them, which it's the puffy little cloud that's the most sort of curious part of the design. I would think that if you had some sort of vehicle, if you remember the movie Fifth Element, they had a big cruise ship in orbit around a planet. And if you ever played the game Spores, which very few of you have probably ever seen Spores, it was invented by the guy that created SimCity, Mr. Wright. Wright. Genius guy. So he created one of the first algorithmically generated games where all the assets were being generated by mathematics. And you couldn't tell. It was amazing. But what he had in the game was when the administrators of the game, because it was an MMO, a massive multiplayer online game, when the administrators wanted to view your world and visit you, they were a UFO. Just like the sports model I put together in season 5, right? It would come down and zip around, and you felt honored that they came to look at you because it was the people that made the game viewing you. So there's this sort of narrative that, I've kind of alluded to on the show, but it's not been specific. And this is all, just fun stuff I'm putting at the end of the episode here. But the idea that there are races that have been reported very humanoid in various cases in South America, where one guy was a preacher, he was doing missionary work. He said a vehicle hovered over their party down there for 3 hours, and there was dudes up there, like DJ booths up there. I mean, it was just like guys waving from up above, lots of people, lots of humanoid people. And it was witnessed by tons of natives. It was sort of the catalyst, I think, for what ended up in Close Encounters. But technically speaking, it could have been after Close Encounters, and maybe that's where he got his DNA from. But the idea that there are vehicles that are simply observing humanity. They might be part of our genetics, and they just want to know how the little petri dish is going on here. Maybe they're from another planet. Maybe our planet's much bigger than we think. Who knows, right? But what would start happening if human beings started making anti-gravity vehicles and start playing in that realm? Playing in the realm of the vehicle that my buddy's dad saw when he was a test pilot. Imagine that. So the UFO thing comes up to your plane, and our UFO comes up to that thing and goes, hey, dude. And then would there be communication? Would it be like the theory of Zephyr and Cochrane from Star Trek hitting warp speed, and then suddenly the Vulcans land because they're like, okay, you're in our backyard. We gotta play together now, which is an old narrative in lots of science fiction stories going back for, 60, 70 years. As soon as you start playing in the galactic realm, you got to get a membership card. Otherwise, you're going to be wiped out, right? The movie The Day the Earth Stood Still in 1951, the entire thrust of that was that Klaatu, the humanoid alien that showed up, needed to warn man because of the invention of atomic bombs that you're now playing with weapons that can actually cause other civilizations problems. And so you need to knock it off. And he wanted to do one thing that was non-lethal to man to get their attention. So he paused the world. And don't watch the Keanu Reeves one. Watch the one from 1951. You'll be greatly rewarded. It's one of the first movies, I think, that used theremin soundtrack. Forbidden Planet really took the theremin to a musical level. But this is just a gem. You can get it on Amazon Prime. It's worth $3, trust me, if you don't already own it. But anyway, I wanted to go through this one time because I've seen some videos go around about the TR-3B recently, and I wanted to kind of look into that and recap all this technology into one episode. But if you haven't been to deepthoughtsradio.com, please go. I'm going to give you a short bumper today. Everything's up there. Thanks to everyone who donates. Take care of yourself and someone else, and I'll see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over and out.